So to demonstrate this idea a little bit further, I want to show you guys another one of the spreadsheets that I made in my free time. The last time I showed you a spreadsheet, it was my mutation engine, I think, but this is a little bit more complicated than that. If you take a look here, I've arranged a number of cells, and each one of these rectangles represents one organism. Let's say it represents one beetle in a population. Some of these beetles are green and some of them are brown. And it's a genetic trait, it's a Mendelian trait. So if you have a dominant allele, you end up brown. If you have two recessive alleles, you end up green. And I only gave one individual in this entire population the green allele. So here's my green guy right here. Everyone else is brown. Everyone else has two dominant alleles, and they have the brown phenotype. So basically I taught Excel how to recognize the difference between capital and lowercase letters and told it some rules for genetics. So each one of these cells is a little genotype phenotype simulator. Then what I did next was I said we're going to pick a random number for each one of these rectangles, a random number, and if it's below a certain amount, then that organism is going to die. It's not going to be able to successfully reproduce. It's going to die off. If it's above that number, then it's going to survive and it's going to be able to reproduce. Then I told the spreadsheet, all right, take the ones that are marked as being alive, and then we're going to pair them up and create another generation with one allele from each parent, which again will be randomly selected. Then I kind of copy pasted my code 25 times so I could have 25 generations of these beetles reproducing. Now, if it was just that, it would be kind of a population genetics simulator, but I added a little twist. I told it, if it has the brown phenotype, all of these rectangles you see with the brown color tagged on it, it has a 50% chance of living or dying. If it has the green phenotype, it has a 30% chance of dying, 70% chance of surviving and reproducing. So I gave green a reproductive advantage, okay? Brown is not very well suited to this environment, but green is. So maybe they are living in an area where there's a lot of leaves and they're living on leaves. So the brown ones, they're sticking out like a sore thumb. They're dying more often. But does that really matter? I mean, look, there's only one green. It's only got these two little alleles in this entire population, and then all the rest of the alleles are these dominant brown genes. Every time I hit the delete key on this spreadsheet, I get a new evolutionary history for this population. It re-rolls all of those random numbers. And this is a typical run of that spreadsheet. So I'm going to show you that here. So we're starting out with nothing but brown in the population, except for one individual who has two recessive alleles. That is the green one in the upper left-hand corner. Now, those are the alleles with the survival advantage. By generation 2, oh no, all of my green are gone. But if you look carefully, you'll see that the green alleles actually did work their way into the population. Green is a recessive allele, so if it only had browns to reproduce with, yes, the next generation is going to be all brown. But don't worry, it's just skipping a generation. See, generation 4, green comes back. Oh, but they died. Well, I did give them a 30% chance of dying. These things happen. Now, generation 5, something catastrophic happened. You could imagine it's a typhoon on the island where they live, is wiping half of them out. But what is genuinely happening is I just made the selection criteria too strong. They had a 50% chance of dying, so 50% of the population just died off in that one generation. What that means is that brown's not particularly well adapted to this environment. So if I just left brown alone for a long enough time, they would eventually all die out because it's just too hard to survive and reproduce. But by generation 6, we have some living green individuals, and you can actually see that some of the recessive alleles happen to work their way in here as well. So some of these other individuals are carriers for that recessive green trait. So green's actually looking okay at this point, considering that it only started with one, and now with a population half the size, we got two greens and a few carriers as well. Generation 7, not much change. We still about have 50% capacity of the population. But by Generation 8, half of the population is green. That's a really staggering increase for green. Now let's keep watching here. Generation 9, most of the population is green. And if you actually take a look, Generation 10 now, brown is extinct. The brown phenotype is extinct. So I could stop it here. But what happens to the population now that all of them are green? Because after all, brown was not very well adapted to this environment, but green is more well adapted. So what happens to the population after this point? By Generation 11, oh, we're making some gains here. Some of the greens are still dying, but most of them are surviving. Generation 12, we have a much healthier looking population. And then by Generation 13, our population is at its carrying capacity, the maximum number of individuals that you could hold in that particular ecosystem. Because the frequency of certain alleles changed in this population over time, eventually the population became more well adapted to its environment than it was to begin with. Okay? Now, what does this spreadsheet prove? Nothing. But it is an elegant demonstration of the idea of evolution. Let's continue our discussion of evolution by means of natural selection by checking your understanding so far. So we have the beginnings of a problem here on the slide. There's an image of an organism which is called a horny toad, a horned lizard. It turns out that horny toads, you've probably heard the term before, they're not actually toads, they're a kind of lizard. Horny toads do have horns, though, even though they're not toads. They have a couple of horns on the back of their heads, which stick out backward, and they have some horns on the side and going down the back as well. And those horns are defensive measures. They allow them to kind of fend off predators. Because where horny toads live, there is another kind of animal called a shrike, and a shrike is a kind of predatory bird. So shrikes spend all day circling around, flying around in the sky, looking for horny toads to pick up and eat. And then they swoop down and they grab the horny toad. But the horny toad, it's got those horns, so it gets a shot to defend itself. It's going to take its horns and rear backwards. It's going to jam its head backwards to try to impale that shrike. And if it manages to hurt the shrike, give it a little bit of a, it'll drop the horny toad. The horny toad will be able to go run off and survive a little bit longer. And the longer a horny toad survives, the more opportunities to mate and pass its genes on to the next generation there will be. So, let's do the scientific method. Observation. Flat-tailed horned lizards defend against attack by thrusting their heads backward and stabbing a shrike with spiked horns at the rear of their skull. Here's the question. Are long horns a survival advantage or short horns a survival advantage? In a population of horny toads, there are some with short horns and there are some with long horns. Horn length is a trait which varies and is heritable. If you have two longhorn parents which mate together, they are going to have longhorned offspring. If you have two short-horned parents which mate together, they're going to have short-horned offspring. So this is one of these traits that natural selection can in fact act on. And you would suppose that probably longhorns are a survival advantage, right? That gives you a tactical advantage. Because with longhorns, if you thrust your head backward, you can impale into the bird deeper. That's going to hurt it more. That's going to be more of a deterrent against being eaten or anything like that. And you're going to have a little bit more range, so probably longhorns would be a survival advantage. But that hypothesis makes certain predictions. One of the predictions made by that hypothesis is if you were to gather up all of the horny toads, live and dead, in an area, well, some of the live ones are going to be live ones that were picked up by shrikes, defended themselves, and then were dropped again. And assuming that the ones that were able to successfully deter an attack had, on average, longer horns, that means that the horn length of the live horny toads should, on average, be a little bit longer. Meanwhile, the dead horny toads in that area, well, they're going to be the ones who were not able to defend themselves. So you would suppose that their horns would be a little bit shorter on average. So this prediction then tells you what kind of experiment you would have to design in order to test it. collect all of the live horny toads in an area, collect all of the dead horny toads in an area, measure their horns, run some statistics, and see who has the longer horns. Now, collecting a sample of live horny toads is relatively easy. You put out some traps, some bait, you put grad students out there to set them up, and you send the grad students out again the next couple of days in order to check the traps. If they caught a horny toad, they measure its horn length, maybe they paint its toenails a nice fuchsia in order to make sure that they don't double count the horny toad twice, or use some other kind of method of tagging to make sure that you don't double count them. And then they release them. They are allowed to go on with their day. But how do you get dead horny toads? How do you collect all of the dead horny toads in an area? Well, as it turns out, the shrikes actually help us out quite a bit with this problem, because the way that shrikes feed is that they pick up the horny toad and then they fly themselves off looking for something like a thorn on a tree or a spike on a fence post or any kind of sharp object, and then they impale that horny toad onto that spike. So down here in the lower left-hand corner, you can see a horny toad skull on a spike. What they basically do is they slam it down there so they can have horny toad on a stick, and they don't have to manipulate it with their talons while they are trying to eat. Very convenient lunch there. So in the areas where both of these organisms exist, the horny toads and the shrikes, you'll find periodically little horny toad skulls kind of decorating fences and trees and thorn bushes and all kinds of things of this nature. So you just send your grad students out with some buckets and you have them collect all of the horny toad skulls that are lying around, and you have them measure those horns as well. And yes, indeed, if you do that, you will find that the live horny toads have on average 10% longer horns than the dead horny toads. Now, if we were to come back every year and do this experiment again and again and again, keep measuring them, we would expect average horn length to increase over time, because the ones that are surviving and reproducing have longer horns, so we would expect every generation to have a slightly longer horn. Now, there could be a point where it goes too far. Famously, people talk about the saber-toothed tiger and the teeth got too large and it may have caused some problems for it. I mean, that's the working hypothesis that some paleontologists are going with. So there is something called stabilizing selection, where a trait could go too far in one direction, but at least for the time being, it looks like longer horns are still the advantageous trait to have in this population. So with those practical examples under our belt, let's take a look at the evidence for evolution. We know that the idea works in concept, right? You can understand it. It's just a mathematical idea that offspring tend to look like their parents. Parents have a whole bunch of different traits. If certain traits make you more likely to have offspring, you're going to tend to have more offspring, so the gene pool of the next generation will have more of that trait, and therefore it'll change generation to generation. Okay, so that idea is relatively simple to wrap your head around. But what kind of evidence do we have that this has actually occurred over the course of Earth's history? Well, it comes in a few different categories. The big one that everyone always thinks about is the fossil record. The fossil record. Now, we truly have a lot of fossils. Every museum is filled to the brim with fossils. People have fossils in their houses. They use fossils as paperweights. We have a mountain of fossil evidence overall. However, only certain organisms are going to leave fossils behind. You have to die in an area that is going to be like a floodplain or a river basin or a swamp or something like that, where sediments are going to accrue over your body and bury you, and then you get mineralized. Only certain areas develop sedimentary rock. So we're not going to have a complete fossil record of every organism that's ever existed. We're just going to have a sample of those organisms that died in areas that were prone to giving us this kind of rock, that were prone to developing fossils. That said, we do have a lot of fossils. And what we've been able to do is take fossils from different eras of time and kind of link them together to see a progression of forms changing over time. One form A to form B to form C to form D. The fossil record was one of the first pieces of evolutionary evidence that we had that organisms were in fact changing over time. Next, we have something called biogeography. Biogeography takes a look at where fossils are located, but also where living organisms
are today. And it tries to map out how organisms migrated from one area to another over evolutionary time. So in order to understand biogeography, you have to understand a little bit about how the shape and the landscape of Earth has developed over time. Pennsylvania used to be a kind of tropical forest, and it was kind of a swampy area, all this kind of stuff, right? Certain areas that are tundra today were very warm, temperate climates in the past. You have different kinds of ecosystems rising and falling at different locations. You also have land masses that are coming together and breaking apart. You might remember from elementary school geology that all continents used to be in one big landmass, Pangea. There have actually been several supercontinents with their own names at different points in history. So what we try to do is map out when organisms developed and what Earth looked like at that point in time, and then as Earth changed, how did those organisms migrate to where their ancestors, their living extant ancestors, live today. So we'll talk about biogeography a little bit. Comparative anatomy is another good mountain of evidence in favor of this kind of evolutionary idea. If you look at two different organisms, you might think, wow, these things could not be more different. But if you dig in a little bit deeper, if you dissect them and you really analyze the structure of how they are put together, you find some very fascinating similarities between multiple kinds of organisms. And we'll take a look at some examples of situations where organisms are a little bit more similar to each other than you might actually expect. Related to comparative anatomy, we have comparative embryology, where we take a look at organisms at early stages of their development. Because sometimes, if you turn the clock back to maybe 1 week after fertilization or 2 weeks after fertilization, you can spot similarities between the embryos of two fairly different organisms that you would have missed if you just looked at the adult organism. So similarities between, say, a fish and a human that you would not have spotted in a fully mature human and fish, but it is clear as day if you check the embryos. Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace didn't have any genetic or DNA evidence or protein-based evidence for their claims at the time. They had a very sound theory, they had mathematical models of how it worked, they had all this fossil evidence and argument from comparative anatomy and all these different ideas, but they didn't know anything about DNA. It was still kind of being worked out at the time. So it was entirely possible that their ideas would have fallen down once we developed DNA evidence and once we started to understand exactly what chemical means organisms use to control their traits over time. But instead what happened is as we cracked DNA and we started sequencing more and more and more genomes, we started to find more support for Darwin and Wallace's idea of evolution by natural selection. We found that organisms that seemed to be closely related to each other were in fact more closely related to each other. In just the same way that you could sequence lots and lots of people's genomes and find that the most closely related person to me on this planet is my brother, we have very similar genomes, and then my cousins are a little bit more distantly related because we share a slightly less recent common ancestor, right? My brother and I share our parents as common ancestors, my cousins and I share our grandparents as recent common ancestors. You can take that same idea and then apply it to all life on the planet and find that all life actually shares common ancestry. You can find out that, say, a coyote and a wolf share a relatively recent common ancestor, and that common ancestor then shares a common ancestor with cats and lions and those kinds of organisms as well, and that organism shares common ancestors with, say, koala bears and kangaroos and those kinds of organisms. So we'll take a look at molecular evidence as well.